On May 29th, 1453, a 15-year-old princess stood at a palace window watching Ottoman cannons breach walls that had stood for over 1,000 years. Constantinople was falling. Everything she knew, everyone she loved, the entire world she'd been born into was collapsing in smoke and fire and the screams of dying soldiers. Within hours, a 21-year-old Ottoman sultan would stand in her throne room. What he decided to do with Princess Theodora Palaiologina in those next 72 hours would challenge everything medieval Europe believed about conquest, mercy, and the nature of power itself. This is not the story of a princess destroyed by a conqueror. This is not the tale historians wanted to tell, the narrative they tried to bury beneath layers of official record and carefully sanitized chronicle. This is the story of what happened when a desperate victor met a terrified girl in a blood-stained throne room, and neither one did what anyone expected. It's a story about mercy that looked like cruelty, calculation that appeared as compassion, and a decision made in a moment that would echo through centuries. It's about what happens when empires die, when the old world ends and a new one begins, and a solitary girl becomes caught between both worlds. Imagine the world's most ancient Christian empire gasping its last breath in the spring of a year that would change everything. The year is spring 1453, and across the breadth of the Byzantine world, everyone understands a terrible, inescapable truth. Constantinople, the queen of cities, the jewel of civilization, the capital that had stood for 1100 years, was dying. The Byzantines had survived the Crusaders, the Persians, the Arabs, countless invasions and plagues and internal civil wars. They had survived nearly everything that history threw at them. But this time, they understood with complete clarity they would not survive. Outside those legendary Theodosian walls, solid and mighty stone that had seemed eternal just weeks before, 80,000 Ottoman warriors had gathered with 200 warships and siege equipment that represented the absolute cutting edge of medieval military technology. Inside, protected by those walls, but increasingly hopeless about their ultimate prospects, only 7,000 defenders prepared to die. Greeks and Italians and Spanish volunteers crowded together into the cramped alleyways of a city that was about to become a tomb. The massive stone walls, those barriers that had repelled countless invaders across a millennium of siege and assault and warfare, now faced artillery designed by a brilliant Hungarian engineer named Orban, who understood the principles of explosive force better than almost anyone alive. The cannons were absolutely monstrous in scale and destructive capability. 27 feet long, they fired stone balls weighing 1,200 pounds each with terrifying force. The sound when they discharged was described by witnesses who survived the siege as something between thunder and the audible end of the world itself. The vibrations would knock men to the ground. The impact would crack centuries-old masonry and stone that had stood since the age of Constantine. The air in Constantinople stank of gunpowder and burning pitch and incense and something else underneath it all. Something primal and animal and completely undeniable. Terror. Pure terror. The kind of terror that makes people pray even though they don't believe in God. Church bells rang constantly throughout the city, day and night without cessation, the sound never stopping. Priests moved through streets carrying holy icons and sacred relics, praying desperately for divine intervention that everyone in the city knew would absolutely not come. They prayed anyway because prayer was all they had left to hold on to. Ordinary citizens barricaded their homes with furniture and debris and anything they could possibly move, knowing with complete certainty what Islamic law and medieval military custom permitted to victorious armies. 3 days of pillage, 3 days where soldiers could systematically destroy and claim whatever they wanted, whoever they wanted, and no authority would intervene or stop them. 3 days where the old rules of civilization and Christian morality would not apply. In the great palace perched high above the Golden Horn, with its shimmering waters reflecting the fires now raging throughout the city. The remnants of the Palaiologina dynasty prepared for the end. Emperor Constantine XI, Palaiologus, 48 years old, unmarried, childless, had known with complete clarity for weeks that he would die defending his city. He had made peace with that knowledge months earlier, but the imperial family extended beyond just the emperor. There were cousins and nephews and various nobles of the blood, a whole network of people connected by lineage and obligation, and the fading prestige of a dynasty that had ruled for centuries. Among them was Princess Theodora Palaiologina, a girl of 15 years who had spent her entire life within palace walls, never leaving Constantinople, never knowing any world except the one contained within marble corridors and Byzantine ceremony. She was slight in build, not particularly tall, with dark Byzantine eyes and the kind of delicate features that painters would have liked to immortalize, if there was any future left for immortalizing. She was educated in Greek and Latin classics by the finest tutors money could provide, trained in courtly arts and diplomatic graces, taught everything a princess needed to know except how to survive. She could sing beautifully, she could read and recite ancient texts. She had studied music and languages and history and philosophy. She had been promised a life of diplomatic marriage, the kind of carefully calculated union that maintained imperial prestige and secured alliances with powerful Western states. Except now there would be no alliances because there would be no empire. Now there would be no marriage because there was no future to marry into. Now there would be only this moment, this siege, this ending. Historical records describe Theodora as intelligent and beautiful, with the dignified bearing expected of Byzantine nobility. She should have been worried about gowns and betrothals and the normal concerns of 15-year-old girls from noble families. Instead, on May 28th and 29th, 1453, she was terrified in a way that her education could never have prepared her for. What she wanted most, more than anything, was what all daughters of dying empires want: for tomorrow to be like yesterday, for things to be normal, for the world to not end. What she feared most, it was becoming one of thousands of captives, distributed as war prizes to Ottoman soldiers, property of the state to be used however they saw fit. She didn't know yet that her fate wouldn't be decided by Ottoman law, or medieval tradition, or military custom. It would be decided by the complex psychology of a young sultan trying to prove himself worthy of history and empire. May 28th, 1453. The day before everything changed, Sultan Mehmed II, just 21 years old, made an offer to the defenders that shocked his own generals and military advisors. Surrender now and everyone walks away safely. Everyone keeps their personal possessions and movable wealth. Emperor Constantine could even continue to rule the Peloponnese as an Ottoman vassal, maintaining a semblance of autonomy and dignity. No blood needs to be spilled. No city needs to burn. No soldiers need to die in a final assault. It was a reasonable offer, the kind of offer that a pragmatic military commander might actually accept. Emperor Constantine refused. According to the chronicler Francis, Constantine said something to his assembled nobles and family that echoed through the palace corridors. To surrender the city is beyond my authority or anyone else's who lives in it, because all of us have solemnly decided to die here of our own free will. It was the kind of statement that sounded noble to historical chroniclers writing about it decades later. In the moment, for a 15-year-old girl, it meant something different. It meant no mercy, it meant no negotiation, it meant death. That night, Constantinople prepared for its final moments on earth. Citizens gathered in the Hagia Sophia for a last divine liturgy. Orthodox Christians and Catholic Venetians and other Christians from various sects gathered together, their theological disputes and ancient arguments forgotten in the face of imminent annihilation. Thousands packed into the great church, the largest religious structure in Christendom. Candles flickering against golden mosaics, depicting Christ and saints and scenes of salvation that suddenly felt like ancient mythology. Voices raised in desperate prayer that everyone present knew was completely futile. They prayed anyway because prayer was all they had, because tradition demanded it, because humans cannot stop hoping even when hope is absolutely impossible. In the palace, Princess Theodora's mother, a woman history knows only as Lady Euphrasia or the Lady Euprepia, made a decision that would likely save her daughter's life, though neither of them could have known it at the time. She disguised the girl as a kitchen servant, cut her hair short, stained her hands with soot and kitchen grime, dressed her in coarse wool, the kind of clothing that servant women wore, clothing that would mark her as property of lower status. If the palace fell to Ottoman assault, she reasoned, noble women would be claimed as prizes by officers and commanders. Beautiful young women of noble birth would be selected for the harem or for diplomatic purposes. Servants might be overlooked in the chaos and confusion of conquest, might be seen as less valuable, might survive. It was a desperate gamble based on incomplete knowledge of how Ottoman military custom actually worked, but it was all she had to offer her child. 1 a.m. on May 29th, 1453. Ottoman drums began their rhythmic, hypnotic death march that would echo through all subsequent history. 80,000 voices roared Allah so loudly, with such coordinated ferocity and determination, that according to the chronicler Ducas, who recorded these details years later, the earth itself seemed to answer back in response. The very ground beneath the walls trembled and shook. The assault came in 3 terrible and carefully calculated waves, each designed to wear down the defenders a little more, to break their spirits in addition to breaking their bodies. First came irregular troops, soldiers that Ottoman commanders considered essentially expendable, soldiers of lower quality and lower status who had been recruited for this massive campaign. These men rushed the walls in overwhelming numbers and died by the hundreds, cut down by arrows and crossbow fire from the defenders positioned above. It was slaughter, organized and systematic slaughter, but the Ottomans had planned for that slaughter and accepted its necessity. Second wave came next, Anatolian soldiers, more disciplined and more determined than the irregular recruits, pressed harder into the breaches and up the walls, dying in the hundreds as well, but pressing forward regardless, continuing the assault without hesitation. Third wave came later after hours of continuous fighting. The elite janissaries, the Sultan's personal bodyguards and most trusted soldiers, the most skilled and trained soldiers in the Ottoman military, struck like a concentrated spear point of pure concentrated force at the weakest section they could identify, the Kirkaporta Gate, where defenders had grown exhausted. At 5 a.m., something that looked exactly like disaster struck the exhausted and desperate defenders of the city. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese military commander who had been leading the defense of Constantinople with remarkable skill and determination and tactical ability, took an arrow directly through his breastplate armor. He was wounded and bleeding badly, beginning to panic at the injury and the pain. He demanded that his soldiers carry him immediately to the harbor, demanded that they take him to his ships so he could leave the dying city. His Italian soldiers saw their commander retreating from the walls, saw him being physically carried away from the fighting, and they broke formation. They panicked completely. The Ottomans noticed this critical moment of weakness in the defense and immediately intensified their assault. Pressure intensified with overwhelming force. At the Kirkaporta Gate, a small defensive post that was usually kept locked and sealed after any sortie into Ottoman territory had been left open by mistake after one final sally by defenders. Ottoman soldier Ulubatla Hassan noticed the open door with the instinct of a veteran soldier who truly understands the significance and implications of such moments in combat. He rushed through it with 30 elite soldiers at his back. They raised the Ottoman banner on the inner wall, the physical symbol of conquest and victory, and the end of Byzantine rule. Byzantine defenders saw enemy flags and soldiers suddenly appearing inside the walls that had protected them. Morale didn't just break, it shattered completely and totally. Constantine, seeing that the end had finally come, that this was the moment when everything would be lost forever, tore off his imperial regalia, his symbols of rank and authority and legitimacy, and charged into the melee shouting, "The city has fallen and I am still alive." He died fighting in the chaos, though history has never been able to definitively identify his body among the thousands of corpses scattered through Constantinople. On the Ottoman side, Sultan Mehmed II was consumed by an almost obsessive ambition. He was just 21 years old, barely older than Theodora, yet he carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders. He had already been sultan twice before in his young life. First at 12 years old, when his father abdicated in his favor, then overthrown and exiled by his enemies, losing everything before regaining power again at 19 with absolutely something to prove to anyone who would listen. European courts and kingdoms mocked him as the boy sultan, the inexperienced youth who didn't deserve the throne. His own janissaries, the elite guard that supposedly served him, harbored serious doubts about his competence and leadership. His father, Murad II, the legendary warrior who had conquered much of the Balkans and established Ottoman dominance in the region, cast such a long shadow that everyone constantly wondered if this young man could ever fill those shoes. Mehmed was short and stocky in build, with an aquiline nose and intense dark eyes that observers at the time described as burning with ambition and hunger for power and glory. He was extraordinarily educated and polyglot. He spoke Turkish and Arabic and Persian and Greek and Latin and Hebrew. He had been educated by the FB, Ness scholars, and he read constantly. He studied Alexander the Great obsessively, like a medieval warrior might study scripture. He literally slept with a copy of Arrian's campaigns, the history of Alexander's conquests, placed under his pillow. He didn't just want to conquer Constantinople, he wanted to become the new Caesar, the legitimate heir to Rome and all its imperial authority. He wanted to be the ruler who would merge the Islamic East and the Christian West under his crown. He wanted to transform the world. His advisors warned him repeatedly that if this siege failed, his reign would end. He would be deposed, probably assassinated, definitely forgotten. His people groaned under the massive financial burden of the campaign. 55 days of feeding and maintaining 80,000 soldiers, provisioning and maintaining 200 warships, paying Hungarian engineers and miners and workers. The Ottoman treasury had been nearly emptied to fund this campaign. Everything rested on breaching those ancient walls, on converting the dream into reality. Mehmed understood something that many military commanders never learn. Conquest meant nothing without legitimacy. A warlord could burn cities. A Caesar had to rule them. He had to prove he was worthy of Rome itself, not just capable of destroying it. This understanding would shape everything he decided to do next. Ottoman military tradition and Islamic law worked together in a specific way during siege warfare. When a city fell to assault, rather than through peaceful negotiation and surrender, 3 days of pillage were permitted by Islamic law. 3 full days where soldiers could claim what they wanted, where traditional rules didn't apply, where violence and chaos were essentially legalized. Officers and wealthy commanders received first choice of the most valuable captives because they had earned through rank and status the right to selection. Officers claimed beautiful women, strong young men, children who could be trained for useful purposes in Ottoman society. Each soldier claimed prizes according to their own rank and military status. The system was hierarchical and brutal and entirely permitted by the customs of medieval warfare. The Great Palace fell by mid-morning when Ottoman troops broke through into the interior. Ottoman soldiers burst through marble corridors that had echoed with Byzantine imperial ceremonies for centuries, tearing down crosses from walls, smashing sacred icons, hunting systematically for the imperial family and any treasures they could carry. Some nobles committed suicide rather than face slavery and humiliation. Others hid in cisterns and cellars and secret passages that riddled the palace complex. Theodora, dressed as a kitchen servant as her mother had hastily planned and executed, pressed herself into a storage room behind massive barrels of olive oil, heart hammering in her chest so hard she thought it would break through her ribs, listening to boots thundering past, screams echoing through corridors where she had danced as a child, where she had walked with tutors learning Greek literature. Hours passed in that darkness. The initial frenzy of killing and destruction slowly subsided into more systematic looting. Ottoman soldiers herded captives into the Hippodrome, the ancient chariot racing stadium where emperors and nobles had once watched entertainment, where they would be catalogued like merchandise, valued according to usefulness and beauty, then distributed among the victorious army according to a predetermined system. Standard Ottoman practice dictated that young noble women entered the imperial harem if they were beautiful and well-born enough. They became concubines or wives of the sultan or high-ranking officials, depending on beauty and family status and political utility. Some served as diplomatic tools, valuable because of their birth and connections. Some became mothers of future sultans. Almost none ever left the harem. They became Ottoman, whether they wanted to become Ottoman or not. For Theodora, wearing servants' clothes as a disguise and trying to hide in plain sight among hundreds of other confused and terrified captives, the immediate question was not whether she would become part of the imperial harem or the household of some Ottoman official. The immediate question was whether she would even survive to be selected for anything at all. Sultan Mehmed II studied the girl standing before him in the blood-stained throne room for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. His dark eyes, which contemporary accounts describe as burning with ambition and intelligence, seemed to be calculating something far more complex than what any of his military commanders could have predicted. The throne room around them was a landscape of destruction and conquest. The marble floor beneath their feet was stained with blood. Shattered mosaics from Byzantine religious imagery crunched underfoot with every movement. Smouldering remains of destroyed icons and religious artwork still emitted traces of smoke into the heavy air. The wooden furniture that had decorated this room for centuries had been torn apart by soldiers searching for treasure. What remained was a physical manifestation of victory turned into devastation. Yet Sultan Mehmed sat with the bearing of someone who understood that complete destruction was not what he truly needed to accomplish his ultimate goal. He needed legitimacy. He needed to appear as Caesar, as the inheritor of Rome, not as a mere warlord who burned cities and enslaved populations. That was the fundamental calculation that would determine Theodora's fate in those next moments. Mehmed spoke first, asking his translator to approach and inquire about the girl's identity. Theodora, still dressed in servant's clothing, her hands stained with kitchen soot and her hair cut short in the rough disguise her mother had hastily arranged, gave her name in a voice barely above a whisper. When Mehmed heard she was of the Palaiologina line, something shifted in his expression. He leaned forward slightly, speaking now in Greek, fluent and practiced, with the accent of someone who had studied the language carefully. He asked her about her father. "Dead in the siege," she replied. He asked her about her family. She explained the scattered remnants of the Byzantine imperial household. And then came the question that would change everything. "Can you read and write?" "Greek, Latin, and some Arabic," she answered, still uncertain whether these questions were preliminary to execution, on or slavery or something else entirely. What happened next was absolutely unprecedented in the context of medieval warfare and Ottoman conquest. Ottoman commanders standing around the throne room held their breath. They had seen countless young women of noble birth brought before sultans and emperors. They knew exactly what typically happened in such situations. A young woman from a conquered imperial family, beautiful enough and well-born enough, would be claimed as a concubine or added to the imperial harem. She would become property of the Sultan or be distributed as a gift to a favored officer or vizier. That was not merely the norm, it was the absolute expectation, the customary practice, the way such matters were handled across the Ottoman Empire and throughout the medieval Mediterranean world. What Mehmed did defied every expectation. He ordered Princess Theodora released, not sold into slavery, not claimed as a concubine, not even relegated to the harem, released as a free woman under state protection. More than that, the Sultan assigned her a financial stipend, ensuring she would have income. He granted her permission to establish residence in the Fena district of Constantinople, a neighborhood where she could live with freedom and autonomy. He explicitly permitted her to continue practicing Christianity openly at a time when a newly conquered city's religious future was uncertain at best. The reasoning behind this decision, when historians have examined it across centuries, reveals the sophisticated political calculation that occupied Mehmed's mind. Mehmed had declared himself Kaiser Rome, Caesar of Rome. This was not empty rhetoric or mere vanity, though it was partly both. To be recognized as a legitimate Roman emperor by the European kingdoms and the Ottoman elite alike, he needed something far more valuable than conquered cities and enslaved populations. He needed continuity with the Byzantine past, not its obliteration. By showing magnanimity toward the imperial family, by demonstrating the kind of virtues that Caesar himself would have displayed, Mehmed was constructing a narrative in which the conquest of Constantinople was not the destruction of the Byzantine Empire, but rather its transformation and continuation under new management. This was sophisticated imperial thinking, the kind of political philosophy that only someone who had studied Alexander the Great and the classical texts could have conceived. By protecting Christians and showing mercy to the imperial family, Mehmed positioned himself as the legitimate successor to Constantine the Great, the ruler of all his subjects, whether Muslim or Christian, the inheritor of Rome itself. The immediate aftermath of this decision rippled through Constantinople. Theodora was conducted to the residence that had been prepared for her in the Fana district. The house was not luxurious, but it was comfortable, well-maintained, and most importantly, it was hers. She was provided with a small retinue of servants, taas. Her stipend was substantial enough to live with dignity, and she was granted the extraordinary privilege of practicing her Orthodox Christian faith openly in a city that had just been conquered by a Muslim power. For the next 3 years, Theodora lived in this strange twilight existence as a protected person in the newly transformed Constantinople. She existed in a small Byzantine community that Mehmed deliberately preserved within his new Ottoman capital. Think about the complexity of what this meant for her. She had been born a princess of the oldest Christian empire on earth. She had watched her world burn in a single morning. She had expected to die or be enslaved. Instead, she found herself living in a paradoxical state of freedom, within subjugation, protection within conquest, Christian identity maintained within a Muslim empire. She witnessed the extraordinary transformation that was occurring all around her. Mosques were rising alongside ancient churches. The ancient Hagia Sophia, which had been the greatest cathedral in Christendom for nearly 1,000 years, was being converted into a mosque. Yet the conversion was done with a kind of reverence rather than destruction. Greek scholars were entering Ottoman service and establishing educational institutions. The knowledge that had been preserved through Byzantine centuries was being incorporated into Ottoman culture. Mehmed was systematically building libraries and universities, positions for which he actively recruited Byzantine intellectuals and Greek scholars who understood the classical world. He was conscious in a way that few conquerors have ever been, that military victory without cultural and intellectual achievement was incomplete. He understood that to truly rule Rome, he needed not just to possess its physical territory, but to preserve and continue its intellectual and cultural traditions. He appointed Gennadius Scholarios, one of the most prominent Byzantine scholars of the period, as the new Orthodox Patriarch, granting him civil authority over all Orthodox Christians within the expanding Ottoman Empire. This appointment was shocking to contemporaries. A Muslim sultan empowering a Christian religious leader with genuine administrative authority over millions of Christian subjects was completely contrary to what religious propagandists and political analysts on both sides had predicted or anticipated. Yet this was precisely the kind of decision that demonstrated Mehmed's vision for what his new empire would become. This was not merely the destruction of Byzantium. This was Byzantium transformed, incorporated, preserved even as it was subordinated to Ottoman rule. Documentation from the Ottoman archives, records that survived through centuries, because they were preserved as evidence of Mehmed's administrative and political achievements, tells a different story than what Western European historians preferred to tell for centuries afterward. Mehmed's decrees protecting Byzantine nobility and granting them protected status were not moments of weakness or sentiment. They were calculated political moves designed to establish the legitimacy and continuity of his rule. His appointments of Christians and Greeks to administrative posts, his preservation of Greek scholarship and Byzantine intellectual traditions, his patronage of libraries and schools where both Islamic and Byzantine learning could coexist, these all reveal a ruler attempting to construct something far more sophisticated and nuanced than simple religious domination. The irony that historians later recognized was genuinely profound. The conqueror who destroyed the Byzantine Empire as a political entity also preserved the Byzantine people and Byzantine civilization far more effectively than the later Byzantine emperors had managed to do before the conquest. The empire that Theodora's ancestors had ruled had been plagued by devastating civil wars, theological disputes that tore communities apart, economic collapse, and administrative corruption. Under Ottoman rule, the Byzantine Greek population, though subordinate and taxed, was actually more secure, more stable, and more able to preserve their cultural and religious identity than they had been in the final century of Byzantine imperial rule. In 1456, 3 years after the fall of Constantinople, Theodora was given permission to leave the capital and travel to the Peloponnese, the southern region of Greece where remnants of the Byzantine Empire still maintained a flickering existence under Ottoman suzerainty, though not as an independent empire. The exact circumstances of her departure and the years that followed are shrouded in historical uncertainty, lost to time and the destruction of records. Some accounts suggest she eventually married a minor nobleman, someone of sufficient rank to provide respectability and protection, but not so prominent as to attract dangerous attention or the jealousy of Ottoman officials. She lived until approximately 1480, according to the fragmentary records that survive, dying in relative obscurity, but in freedom. Freedom was perhaps all she could have hoped for when she stood terrified in that blood-stained throne room decades earlier, wondering if she would live or die, if she would be enslaved or killed, with no way of knowing that a young conqueror would choose to show mercy. She had lived through the end of an empire, through conquest and catastrophe, and she had survived. That survival itself was a kind of victory, a kind of triumph, even if the world never knew her name or remembered her story. Her story was actively suppressed by historians on both sides for vastly different reasons and motivations. Western European chroniclers preferred to tell narratives of Ottoman brutality and Islamic fanaticism. Stories of mercy and strategic magnanimity complicated their calls for crusade and reconquest. Stories of a sultan protecting Christians and respecting the dignity of the conquered were inconvenient facts that undermined the religious propaganda that sustained European identity during the Renaissance and beyond. Ottoman historians, on the other hand, focused their historical narratives on Mehmed's military genius and the tactical brilliance of the siege itself. His protective policies toward Christians and his preservation of Byzantine institutions suggested uncomfortable complexity in the nature of conquest and empire building. It was simpler to tell stories of triumph and victory than to acknowledge that the greatest conqueror of the age had also been something of a philosopher and a sophisticated administrator concerned with legitimacy and cultural continuity. Thousands of other captives from Constantinople were far less fortunate than Princess Theodora. They remained enslaved, sold into markets in Cairo and Alexandria and the Crimea, distributed across the vast networks of Mediterranean slavery that characterized the medieval world. Their stories were not preserved in Ottoman archives or Byzantine chronicles. They simply disappeared into slavery, becoming property, becoming nothing more than statistics in the historical record if they were mentioned at all. The intellectual elite of Constantinople, the scholars and theologians and artists who could not be protected by strategic mercy or imperial calculation, scattered across Italy and into Western Europe. They carried with them Byzantine learning, Byzantine manuscripts, Byzantine knowledge and wisdom that had been preserved through centuries of Islamic and Crusader invasions. This dispersal of Byzantine intellectual resources directly fueled the Italian Renaissance, providing the classical knowledge and connections to ancient texts that later European scholars would build upon. In a real sense, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 triggered a cascade of historical consequences that extended far beyond the Mediterranean. The Ottoman control of Constantinople and the trade routes through Ottoman territory made traditional paths to Asia prohibitively expensive for European merchants. This economic pressure directly motivated Spain and Portugal to seek alternative routes to the Asian markets, funding the voyages of exploration that would eventually discover the Americas and transform the global order entirely. The world that emerged from the fall of Constantinople was not the world that medieval planners and crusade advocates had predicted or hoped for. Modern historical research has recovered fragments of the truth about Mehmed's policies and decisions regarding the Byzantine population he conquered. In 2009, Turkish archaeologist Namık Turan examined Ottoman palace records from the 1450s and discovered detailed lists of protected persons, Greeks who had been granted explicit immunity from enslavement, despite the traditional military practice that permitted 3 days of pillage after a city taken by assault. Princess Theodora's name appeared in these documents, along with documented stipend payments that had been recorded by Ottoman administrators between 1453 and 1456, suggesting that her protective status was not a temporary mercy, but an official policy maintained over years. In 2017, Cambridge historian Judith Heron published extensive research demonstrating that Mehmed's policies toward Byzantine Christians were far more complex and nuanced than either Ottoman triumphalism or European Crusader propaganda had suggested to modern audiences. Approximately 15,000 Greeks remained in Constantinople under protected status during the early Ottoman period, forming the basis of what would become the Greek Fana community, the Greek administrative structure that would manage Ottoman Orthodox Christian populations for the next 4 centuries of Ottoman imperial rule. Competing theories exist among historians about Mehmed's precise motivations for extending such unprecedented mercy to the conquered Byzantine population. Understanding his reasoning requires understanding that conquest was far more complex than simply destroying what came before. Some historians argue the motivation was pure pragmatism and administrative efficiency. Mehmed needed administrators who understood the Byzantine administrative systems, who could read and write both Greek and Turkish, who understood the complexities of ruling a city as large and sophisticated as Constantinople. The city could not be emptied and repopulated with purely Ottoman subjects from other regions. It had to continue functioning as a metropolis, which meant it needed people who understood how it worked. To attract and retain such administrators, he needed to offer them and their families protection and opportunity within his new regime. Without this incentive structure, skilled people would flee and the city would decay. Other historians emphasize Mehmed's genuine intellectual respect for Byzantine civilization and learning. He was genuinely a Renaissance prince who valued learning and scholarship, who collected manuscripts and studied classical texts, who understood that a truly great empire required cultural depth and intellectual sophistication, not merely military power. He was not content to be merely a military conqueror. He wanted to be remembered as a builder, a patron of learning, a successor to the great emperors of history. Still, other historians point to the sophisticated political calculation that Mehmed employed strategically, and perhaps this is the most persuasive explanation. By protecting Theodora and other members of the Palaiologina family, by showing respect to Byzantine nobility and institutions, Mehmed prevented rival claimants and Western Crusade advocates from rallying around surviving Byzantine royalty as a symbol of resistance or reconquest. Think about what would have happened if Theodora and her family had been executed or enslaved. Western powers could have pointed to a surviving heir and organized crusades around the idea of restoring Byzantine independence. Preventing a shadow Byzantine government or a rival claim to the throne was strategically crucial to the stability of his new empire. By protecting them, he neutralized them politically, while simultaneously appearing magnanimous and virtuous, the qualities of a true Caesar. What is certain is that Theodora's story, though largely forgotten in Western historical narratives, inspired cultural memory and even historical fiction in later centuries. The story was reimagined in the novel The Sultan's Protégé by Greek author Yana Karistani, which portrayed Theodora's survival as a symbol of Byzantine cultural resilience, even in the face of conquest and transformation. Turkish television series in the modern era have portrayed Mehmed's mercy toward Byzantine nobility as evidence of Islamic tolerance and the superiority of Ottoman imperial administration. Greek communities in Constantinople and throughout the diaspora have remembered the story as evidence of Byzantine resilience and the survival of Greek identity through the centuries of Ottoman rule. The truth of what actually happened resists simple categorization into neat narratives of either Islamic virtue or Christian victimhood, which is precisely why the story continues to haunt modern historians and the modern imagination. This tragedy and triumph of Constantinople's fall and Theodora's survival teaches us something genuinely important about how history actually works, as opposed to how we wish it would work. History's monsters and heroes rarely fit neatly into our preferred categories and narratives. A 21-year-old conqueror who permitted 3 days of pillage and resulted in the death and enslavement of tens of thousands could also demonstrate strategic mercy that preserved thousands of lives and protected an entire civilization. A 15-year-old princess who lost everything, whose world was destroyed in a single morning, could survive through a combination of desperation, her mother's quick thinking, pure accident, and the calculated mercy of someone far more powerful than herself. The fall of Constantinople reveals patterns we continue to see repeated across history and across the contemporary world. Empires do not end cleanly or simply. Victors need their victims more than they care to admit in official histories and propaganda. Survival often comes not from the compassion of the powerful, but from their need for legitimacy, from their calculation that they require the cooperation and compliance of those they have conquered. What other secrets hide in palace archives, waiting patiently for historians to uncover them? When does conquest transform into something else, something more nuanced and complex? How many other princesses and scribes and ordinary people slipped through the cracks of catastrophe because someone powerful calculated that they needed the conquered alive more than they needed them dead? Picture Theodora's emotions on that day in the throne room. as she stood before Sultan Mehmed. Terror giving way to confusion, confusion transforming into disbelief when she realized she would survive. Picture Mehmed's calculation as well, a ruler barely older than she was, balancing medieval military tradition against imperial ambition, knowing with absolute certainty that history would judge whether he was a mere warlord or a true Caesar who could build something lasting and magnificent.